While fire is not present with every covenant God makes with his people throughout the Bible, they play a major role both literally and metaphysically. Let's go beyond the verse, where we explore fire in God's covenants. While a supernatural flame appears in Genesis 3 verse 24 with the flaming swords guarding the gates of Eden, and a regular flame, the next chapter in Genesis 4 verses 4 through 5 with Abel's acceptable offering, it is Genesis 15 verse 17 through 21 where we encounter fire in God's theophany. Starting with verse 17, it says, "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, behold, a smoking fire and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the halves of the carcasses. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites.'" Here we see God appearing in three distinct fiery elements. First, a smoking fire pot. The Hebrew is tanur, which means portable oven or furnace, which might suggest some type of embodiment, as in Jesus Christ pre-incarnate. Then the word flaming is the Hebrew word esh, which means fire, literally or figuratively. This might suggest the Holy Spirit. Then finally, the word for torch is lapid, which is translated into lightning in Exodus 20 verse 18, consistent with many other theophanies of God the Father where lightning is present. With this passage here from Genesis 15 being the first official covenant that God makes with his people, it's interesting to see the presence of a potential Trinity woven into the text to describe this fiery presence of God. We move on to Exodus 19, God's covenant on Mount Sinai with Moses, the Mosaic covenant. Exodus 19 verse 18 says, "Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire." This fire revealed God's majesty and holiness, but we know it was somewhat supernatural, because Moses, who was in God's presence at this time to receive the Ten Commandments, came down from the mountain with his face shining like the sun, as outlined later in Exodus 33 and Exodus 34. But here again, just like in the Abrahamic covenant, God appears as fire. We then have the debated Levitical covenant, which is given in Numbers 25. The entire Levitical system is rooted in fire. The Levitical priesthood were tasked daily for burnt offerings, incense, with fire on the altar that was to never go out, according to Leviticus 6:12 through 13. Fire from the Lord consumed acceptable sacrifices, as outlined in Leviticus 9:24, and there are even judgments by fire, like in Leviticus 10 verse 2, where it says, "So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them." So while this wasn't a direct theophany as a means for covenant, like it was for the Mosaic and Abrahamic covenants, it's interesting how fire or burning is central to what the Levitical priests are tasked to do. And as we step into the Davidic covenant, it's interesting to note that there are no obvious rituals or theophanies associated with fire for David. This might be interesting considering the fact that Jesus does not have a mention of fire in the Passion Week leading up to his death and resurrection. Of course, throughout his ministry, there are moments when fire is mentioned. Matthew 3 verses 11 and 12 talks about how he will be baptized in the Holy Spirit and fire. And later, Jesus rebukes John and James for asking to use fire from heaven to judge others in Luke 9 verses 54 through 56. Jesus declares his fiery mission in Luke 12 verse 49, where it says, "I came to send fire on the earth, and what will I if it be already kindled?" Other mentions of fire have to do with hell or Gehenna. Even in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where in Luke 16:24 it says, "I am in agony in this fire." Matthew 25:41 says that the cursed will be banished into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Yet in the Passion Week, the mention of fire is absent, especially during the new covenant forming at the Last Supper, where instead of supernatural flame, Jesus broke bread and drank wine. But this lack of fire during the Passion Week, and especially specifically the New Covenant, might suggest what the messianic prophecies of Isaiah 42:3 says. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. And to conclude this small study is Pentecost in Acts 2, where they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire, all of them filled with the Holy Spirit. This is when the benefits of the new covenant begin to spread, where the power and knowledge of God through the Spirit was no longer isolated theophanies, but thanks to Jesus on the cross and resurrection, available to anyone who believes.